reasons, we haven't spent a lot of this offseason talking about Santi Aldama. Is it because everyone's assuming that he's going to be a member of the rotation? Is it because he's just not a super big ultra personality on this team, or he's not someone who's going to be projected to start because Jaren Jackson Jr. is in front of him? Whatever it is, we haven't talked much about Santi, but we're about to today because I do not believe that Santi Aldama's spot on this roster is 100% a given. Let's talk about it right here coming up on Locked On Grizzlies.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host today, Damichael Cole, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal right here in Memphis, Tennessee. Going solo today, Joe Mullinet's getting a well-deserved day off. On today's show, we got a lot to talk about. We're going to actually talk about a lot of the current Grizzlies. We spent a lot of time talking about trade stuff and, draft things and all that, but we gotta circle back to actually what's here, what's on this team right now, because I think there are a couple interesting things to point out. One is we haven't talked about certain guys on this roster because we spent a lot of time talking about Ja, Dez, Jaren, and we even talked about the bottom of the roster, the status of guys like Scottie Pippen, Junior going forward. We even talked about the G.G. Jacksons and the Vince Williams, the guys who emerged. But what about those guys who kind of fit in between all of that? We talked about Luke Kennard a lot because of the team option and everything that's on the line with him this offseason. But there are so many players who I consider, tweeners at this point in the offseason for the Grizzlies because they could be traded. They could be out of the rotation. They could be in the rotation. Like, you just don't know, what's next for a lot of these guys. And we're going to talk about a few of those guys in today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies. But before we get to that, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Speaking of get started, we're going to start today's show. We're talking about a guy who is kind of, solidified himself as a rotation member in each of the past two seasons. But what does that mean going forward as the Grizzlies go in a different direction and a lot of things changes around the team? And that's Santi Aldama. We haven't talked about Santi a lot this offseason. And the question that I have and the question that I'm going to address here is, where does he stand in the midst of all this? Now, in a nutshell, you look at it, you say, he's Jaren Jackson Jr.'s backup. And I've talked about the reason the Grizzlies like Santi. After they picked him late in the first round and everything, the Grizzlies had an opportunity where they could have said, hey, Kyle Anderson, he spent some valuable years here. We're going to bring him back. But no, they want to go in a different direction. Kyle Anderson went to Minnesota, and we say he's playing valuable playoff minutes there now. But the decision in going with Santi over Kyle Anderson wasn't any he's a better player or anything. It's more about fit. His shooting it was something the team valued. You remember when Jaren Jackson Jr. was hurt before the start of last season, not this season. Last season when he had the off-season foot procedure and whatnot, Santi Aldama was the guy who took that opportunity and won the starting job over several other players. There were rookies. Jake LaRavia, David Roddy, all those guys were involved. There was talk of the Grizzlies potentially going small, playing Dylan Brooks, at the foursome or whatever the case may be. But in that situation, we saw Santi Aldama came, won the starting spot at power forward and played decently well in that stretch. But here's why we got to have this conversation. Yes, Santi is a very capable floor stretcher and all these things, but I haven't seen enough improvement from Santi Aldama to say that, yeah, he's a member of this rotation without a doubt going into next season. And I'm going to get into a couple reasons why this is a a conversation that's worthwhile. When we're going to talk a little bit, about the contract, about the roster depth, both of those things. But just before we get to those things, we got to talk about Santi as a player himself. Remember, the key reason Santi Aldama was placed in this rotation was because of his ability as a guy who can stretch the floor as a shooter. Last season averaged 9 points a game. This season averaged 10.7 points a game. Last season played 77 games. This year he played 61 games. Decently available for the most part. But here's where the problems come in. Let's go to last season, which was his second year in the NBA. His first year in the NBA didn't really play much with the Grizzlies. 32 games, spent a lot of time with the Memphis Hustle and all that good stuff. But he shot 35% from three-point range that year and shot 47% from the field overall. If you remember before this season, Santi was talking about, how he's, changed his diet, was eating, I think, up to 5-6 times a day. Getting stronger was a huge key for him and all of that. But if you watch the Grizzlies this season, you didn't see a stronger Santi Aldama. You just didn't. You saw a guy who still kind of looked incapable of taking advantage of those smaller matchups, so much to the point where the Grizzlies, played him at small forward for some stretches this past season. And quite frankly, he didn't look too out of position. It wasn't a huge out of position thing to me because from a physical standpoint, that's kind of where he is. But you would see, like we saw it in FIBA's a little bit. And I always make real good note of like what players' former teammates do to attack them because those guys know them very well. And when I watched FIBA last year and we saw that Canada versus Spain game and Dylan Brooks just kept going straight into the chest of Santi Aldama, to me that was telling. That was Dylan Brooks saying, "Hey, yeah, I played with this guy a couple years, and I know he's not strong. I know he doesn't have strength. I'm going to drive right into his chest, and I'm going to continually pound in his chest until he proves he can stop it." Like at the end of the day, for Santi, it's going to be about the strength, and we didn't see enough improvement, over the course of the season in that area. Then there's the shooting, right? You look at the past two seasons. 35.3% a couple seasons ago, 34.9% this past season. So you're talking about a guy who's around 35%. 35% as a three-point shooter is not enough. It's not enough for the Grizzlies. Not from a guy you depend on to be your stretch big for his career. He's a 33.3% three-point shooter. And for a guy who takes a lot of three-pointers, if you talk about over the last couple seasons, Santi, this year, 5 3-point attempts per game. 2 seasons ago, 3.5 3-point attempts per game. We talked about it in recent episodes. Like, shooting is a huge need for this team just as much as this whole big man conversation. Shooting is just as important. And Santi is a guy that the Grizzlies have relied on and depended on to help them in that area. Quite frankly, he hasn't been good enough. Like, if you're a stretch big, you got to be a stretch big. He's playing the role of a stretch big from a volume standpoint, but the efficiency has not matched, at that level. So then you get into the contract situation and things like that. With the contract, Santi Aldama this year, he's extension eligible. This is the first time he will be rookie extension, eligible. And of course, this is something we'll follow all the way up pretty much until the beginning of the season. We've seen in the past, whether it was Brandon Clark, John Morant, Desmond Bain, Jaren Jackson Jr., John Konchar, the Grizzlies have extended these guys that they feel like fit into the long-term core of this team. Is Santi Aldama someone who's going to get extended? I quite frankly don't think so. The Grizzlies do have the option of him playing out this upcoming season, playing out next season, and then after that he'll be a restricted free agent going into next summer, and they could send him a qualifying offer or match any offer that he gets or whatever. But basically, if the Grizzlies want to, they have another year of contractual control if he doesn't get any other worthy offers to the table. But this is a huge year for Santi, which also brings me back to, why are we even having this conversation? Amongst the productivity things, amongst the contract things, the Grizzlies roster just has depth now. And when you look at the 4 spot, there's not a lot of natural depth at the 4. Like, this is a position that I think, probably will get addressed when you talk about adding forwards, adding, bigger power forward type guys who play the 4 and the 5. Even with Santi, I think that's another problem, so to speak, with him is he can play the 4, but we saw I thought it was very telling in the second half of the season when you had three bigs available when it was Trey Jemison, Jaren Jackson Jr., and Santi Aldama, and the Grizzlies still weren't playing Santi at the five unless they just absolutely had to. You could tell that they really don't want to put him at the five. And I think in today's NBA, you would much rather have a guy who's very capable of playing the four and the five a little bit more than Santi has shown up to this point in his career. But from a roster depth standpoint, we know about the starters. We know Jaren Jackson Jr., Desmond Bain, John Morant, probably Marcus Smart, or whatever the case may be. And we know they're going to probably address the center spot. If you go to the bench, you got Luke Kennard and all those guys. But I want to more so point out the fact that, like, if Marcus Smart is in your starting lineup, like, let's just say that for now. We're going to talk more about him and whatnot later. But you got Vince Williams and Gigi Jackson and Luke Kennard coming off the bench. Luke Kennard's going to be a backup guard for you. Vince Williams is going to be a backup wing for you. He's going to play. Gigi Jackson has to play somewhere. And Gigi Jackson, if you're playing Luke Kennard as the backup two, you're playing Vince Williams as the backup three. Gigi Jackson makes sense as your backup four, right? If you don't put Gigi Jackson as your backup four, you're putting Santi Aldama as your backup four because Brandon Clark is your backup five. So if you're putting Santi as your backup four, where does Gigi Jackson go? So it's very simple. To me, this comes down to how much do the Grizzlies value Gigi Jackson. I think every indication that I've seen, every indication that you've seen with your two eyes show that this guy is a pivotal part of the future of this team, which brings into question the stability and the potential long-term outlook on Santi Aldama. I think there are teams that would love to get a guy who's 6'10", 6'11", can handle the ball, has some playmaking ability to him, and has some shooting ability. That, quite frankly, I think at any point he can unload a 38% 3-point shooting type of season. It hasn't happened yet, but he's very much capable. I've seen him shoot the ball in practice a lot, and Santi Aldama is there. He's taking 5 3-pointers a game because he makes a lot of them in practice, and he has that type of green light. But the point is, when you combine all these factors, the productivity from his second season to his third season, that's when a player like him was supposed to take a big jump. It didn't happen. He didn't get stronger. The shooting efficiency wasn't better. His 2-point field goal percentage went down, as in fact. Then you look at the contract situation. This is a year. If the Grizzlies wanted to move him, this would be the time they would be able to. I'm sure there would be some type of interest in a guy like Santi Aldama. And then the roster depth standpoint, like I said, if you look at the way the roster's outlined right now, it's going to come down to Gigi Jackson and Santi Aldama. That's a solidified spot. Vince Williams, I think he's solidified. And even if you flip Marcus Smart and Vince Williams, or however you want to do it, like those guys are solidified. So Brandon Clark solidified. That fourth spot needs to be addressed. You would think, Santi has solidified that, but Gigi Jackson's emergence has kind of brought into question, that idea. So I think at the end of the day, you're choosing Gigi Jackson over Santi. And if you don't have Santi in the rotation, somebody out there will value that type of player. And that's why we're having this conversation right now. There are a couple other Grizzlies players we should be having this conversation about as well. Who else isn't really just all that safe on this Grizzlies roster? We're going to talk about that here in a second. But before we get to that, today's episode is also brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. FanDuel is where you go to make every moment more. Because here's the thing. So new customers right now, you get $150 in bonus bet with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets to spread on spreads, money lines, player props, and much more. All you got to do is visit FanDuel.com/locked on right now and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel is America's #1 sports book. So make sure you visit FanDuel.com and take advantage of these great opportunities that is available over there right now. Go look at the NBA playoff games right now. How about those Timberwolves? They're hanging around. I think last I checked, they were around plus 400 to come back and win that series against the Mavs. So that's another opportunity that you could potentially take advantage of. But FanDuel.com/locked on is where you'll go to take advantage and to make any opportunity more. Coming up next here on Locked On Grizzlies, we're going to talk about some other players on the Grizzlies. We talked about Santi Aldama, and now we got to talk about some other guys. Let's see where they stand as well. So stay tuned for that. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies, everyone. Damichael Cole, beat writer for Commercial Appeal here in Memphis, Tennessee. We just talked about Santi Aldama, where he stands on the Grizzlies, but then there are a couple other guys as well. Quite frankly, I'm of the opinion that this is a big summer for the Grizzlies, and we know that they have limited roster spots, right? We talked about the idea that right now, you lose LaMarcus Stevens, Yuta Watanabe's gone, and now you're gonna have to address this team option with Luke Kennard. But there just aren't a lot of roster spots to go around to just go out in free agency and just add whoever you want because you got a first round pick. That's one guaranteed contract, and then you technically only have one more roster spot. But there is a way to create some flexibility here based on what you do with a lot of these guys on the roster who, I mean, for lack of better words, who could be considered just, over redundant of what you already have on the roster. The Grizzlies have kind of doubled down to a certain degree in the past on drafting certain type of archetypes. And for the guys who haven't panned out, it's just not a lot of time left for a team that's trying to compete for championships really soon. But two guys I want to talk about real quick. One is Ziaire Williams. And I'll start with Ziaire Williams simply because of the fact that, we talked about this a lot. Like, personally, I've said this, yes, you could talk about the talent, the talent with him. He has not lived up to the standing of a guy who was once a 5-star recruit, coming out of high school, went to Stanford and all that. But at the same time, I do think there's somewhat of it's coaching too, in my opinion, because I've seen Ziaire really. I've seen the strengths of his game, and when you watch him play, you don't see the strengths of his game being the main parts of his games. Uh, Ziaire Williams is a terrific mid-range shooter. You don't see him taking a lot of mid-range shots. You see him shooting a lot of three-pointers. He's a poor three-point shooter. He's below league average. Why is someone taking so many shots in an area they're below league average as opposed to the area where they are above league average? That's the case with Ziaire Williams. Some of that has to be coaching because as a coach, I think you should notice the fact that, hey, look, Ziaire, stop taking so many threes. You are one of the better mid-range guys. And Ziaire has told me himself that mid-range, that's my bread and butter. He's been working on that since he was a little kid. That's his shot. That's where his confidence is. That's where he likes to get on the floor. Take advantage of that. Use that a little bit more. Now, with all that being said, he has not progressed to the level that you would want him to at this point. I said before last season, you hoped that during Dylan Brooks' last season that Ziaire Williams would kind of take a lead and whatnot, and then after Dylan Brooks left, he would claim the starting small forward spot, and then everything just ho hum goes on. But that's not what happened, and now we're talking about Ziaire Williams from the standpoint of he's a key player who could be traded this off season. He's making over $6 million per year. He's making over $6 million this season, so decent sizable contract or whatever. And I think he is one that's definitely in that position because right now it's all about complimenting the star player. And to compliment John Morant, to compliment Desmond Bain, you need guys who can shoot the basketball, spot up shooters. The Grizzlies tried to play Ziaire Williams and pick and rolls and things like that a little bit more, but it hasn't worked out to me. Taylor Jenkins compliments him sometimes, in front of the media, but look, I use my eyes too. I'm not just going to go off everything that Taylor Jenkins says when he's talking about, Ziaire Williams being a good secondary playmaker and things like that. I don't see a good secondary playmaker when I see Ziaire Williams at this point. I see someone who's capable, who can slip off of a screen and then dump a bounce pass off to Brandon Clark or whoever the case may be and make some plays. But I also see a guy who struggled in that role since he was in summer league, a couple years ago and whatever the case may be. But at the end of the day, he has to be on the list. If you say, hey, the Grizzlies need to move some of these players on the current roster, they are overloaded on the wing. Right now, they have more wings on the roster than any point of the last 2 seasons. Ziaire Williams is a main candidate who could be moved in that option. And another guy that I would look at is John Konchar. And we know the contract situation is different for him. You're talking about a guy who is under contractual control for the next 4 years in John Konchar. But at the same time, it's a different situation. Because he's not making, it's not a super sizable contract. That contract could become a valuable contract where certain teams would look at that and say, hey, you tell us we can get a guy who could be a 3 and D player at his best, quality rebounder, a solid defender, and we would take that. I'm pretty sure there are some teams that would see that John Konchar contract and say, okay, we can take that on. But in Memphis, I don't know. And John Konchar gets the same look as you see, with Ziaire Williams and, as I said, with Santi Aldama as well. The big thing for me with all these guys, even John Konchar, is the fact that they all had opportunity this past season to elevate their games to another level after it was very clear what each of them needed to work on last offseason. But it didn't happen. I didn't see Ziaire Williams' game go to another level. I didn't see Santi's game go to another level. I did not see John Konchar's game go to another level. John Konchar this past season. We talked to him before the season, we talked to him at the end of last season, and all he kept saying was, I just got to shoot the ball more. I just got to shoot the ball more. I just got to shoot the ball more. Last season, John Konchar took 2.5 3-point attempts per game. This season, down to 2.2. Not only that, he shot a career low 31.7% from three-point range. And, of course, I contribute that to the fact that he was playing with guys and he was getting different shots. John Konchar, when he's on the floor with Ja Morant and Desmond Bane, those three-point shots are going to be wide open. When he's on the floor with all due respect to Jordan Goodwin and, some of those guys that he was on the floor with, teams aren't going to respect them as much as shooters. So they're going to stay attached to John Konchar, and he's not going to get that many shots. And as a result, you get a guy who's shooting below 32% from three-point range. I still think there's value in John Konchar. I do. I love the defense. Taylor Jenkins thinks there's value in him. I like the ability to play the 2, to play the 3, to play the 4 even in stretches, and the rebound. Like, the Grizzlies need good wing bounders, and we talked about how Vince Williams has helped to elevate the team in that area, because when Jaren's playing at the 5, or even sometimes when Jaren's at the 4, you're going to need that extra guy that's going to come crashing down. And just like Vince Williams has proved he can be that guy, John Konchar has definitely done that. But again, just like Ziaire Williams, this would be a great time if the Grizzlies say, hey, this thing isn't working out like we wanted to. And I think that the idea of moving John Konchar in a trade with a decent contract makes sense for the Memphis Grizzlies. So if you're following along, I just gave Santi Aldama, Ziaire Williams, John Konchar. That's pretty much 3 players who the Grizzlies have currently on the roster, but that's why the whole, I've talked about how, there's some roster limitations to what the Grizzlies can do in the offseason, but there is the possibility where they can possibly create more roster flexibility with those 3 names in particular. Those are the names that stand out to me above any other ones. Santi Aldama, Ziaire Williams, John Konchar. If the Grizzlies are to create more roster spots or whatever the case may be, look no further than beyond those 3 guys. That's where the movement could potentially happen in Memphis for the Memphis Grizzlies. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and you have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Well, just make the switch over to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming that you get over there on ESPN and Fox Sports. Locked On Sports Today brings you the can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. Coming up next on Locked On Grizzlies, talked about the current players enough. Like, that's enough for one episode. Now we got to switch back to bread and butter right now, and that's some draft stuff. Draft workouts are underway in Memphis. I'm going to tell you what I've heard up to this point and what you need to know. Coming up here next on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies, everyone. I am Damichael Cole, beat writer here at the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, Tennessee. Appreciate you guys for tuning in with us on today. Make sure you continue to like, rate, comment, review, subscribe to Locked On Grizzlies, and continue to stay tuned in with us throughout the offseason. We got a lot of fun stuff to talk about in June. We're going to have draft experts and everything else coming on the show to break down everything that's going on. So make sure you stay tuned for all of that. And, of course, we're always welcome to your suggestions. Let us know what you want to see on the show. What do you like? And all of those good things. But now let's switch the tones. We talked about Santi, Ziaire, and John Konchar. We got to switch tones a little bit back to the draft. Just want to say the draft workouts are very much well underway here in Memphis. The Grizzlies are here now, and when I say the Grizzlies are here, I mean literally like the front office and everyone is they're buckling down. It's time. They've already worked out a few players as well, and there are going to be some names that come in next week. As I learn some of those names, of course, we will talk about them, on the show as well. So some names are starting to come into Memphis as draft workouts start to get underway here. And some of you may say, well, what are the importance of draft workouts? Well, this is the bread and butter to me when you talk about what prospects like the draft combine, that stuff's cool and whatnot. But when the prospects come to Memphis, one, there's interest. There's the Grizzlies say, hey, we want that guy to come to Memphis, work out, and we want to see what he's capable of. That's a starting point. But then you get the conversations, right? You talk to Zach Kleiman, you talk to Tayshaun Prince, you talk to Rich Shaw, you talk to other members of the Grizzlies front office, Taylor Jenkins. And again, I talked about how Taylor Jenkins during this side of the season, he's basically like a de facto front office member. He's very heavily involved in conversations with Zach Kleiman. And he's going to be involved in watching these guys. They're going to watch these players really close. And as more players continue to come in, we're going to have you covered here on Locked On Grizzlies with everything that's going on that end. So make sure you stay tuned for that as draft workouts get underway in Memphis at FedEx Forum. Look, I know there's some other things going on in Memphis this weekend as well. The Megan Stallion concert on today. But after that, the Grizzlies draft workouts will be a heavy part of what goes on here next week. Of course, me and Joe Monax, what we learned, we will cover here on Locked On Grizzlies, and we'll break that down because there's a couple of prospects in particular. I want to see the centers. I want to see who comes out. I'm going to check, talk to people, see how those guys even perform in those centers, and see what we can learn from those opportunities. But no show on tomorrow, by the way. Me and Joe Monax getting a 3-day weekend, so we'll be back with you on Monday for that show as well. But thank you guys again for tuning in to Locked On Grizzlies as always. And remember, Locked On Grizzlies is free and available wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, I'm Damichael Cole, and we'll see you on Locked On Grizzlies.